The house they thought was theirs. The first Christmas my mother forgot to invite me, I convinced myself it was an accident. The second year, she said she thought I was working. By the fifth, she had stopped inventing good excuses. Last December, I drove 4 hours through sleet with gifts in my trunk and found my parents' house glowing with lights, music, and every relative I had been told was staying home this year. My mother opened the door, stared at the bags in my hands, and said, "Marin, you should have called first." 3 weeks later, my younger sister posted a family photo from that night with the caption, "Nothing matters more than everyone being together." I was not in the picture. 11 months after that, when my mother learned I had bought an 8-bedroom historic house in the Berkshires, she created a family group chat called Cassidy's Wedding Weekend and assigned bedrooms before she ever asked whether anyone could stay there. When I said no, she replied, "You are single, Marin. What exactly do you need all that house for?" By Christmas Eve, 23 relatives, a caterer, a photographer, and my sister's wedding planner were standing outside my gate because my mother had promised them I would eventually come to my senses. That was the night I stopped trying to earn a place in the family photo and finally decided who was allowed inside the frame. My name is Marin Holt. I was 36 years old when this happened, living in Boston, and working in hospitality operations. I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, with my parents, Graham and Lorraine, and my younger sister, Cassidy. We were comfortable, respectable, and very good at looking like a close family. Inside the house, one rule shaped almost everything. Cassidy's disappointments were emergencies, while mine were lessons in resilience. When I was 12, I won a regional academic competition the same weekend Cassidy failed to make a dance team. Mom left my certificate in a drawer because celebrating might make Cassidy feel worse. At 16, I worked all summer to buy a laptop. When Cassidy ruined hers with a spilled drink, Dad asked me to share mine because I was better about making do. If I objected, Mom called me rigid. That word followed me into adulthood. Rigid meant I remembered promises, wanted my things returned, or failed to volunteer whatever Cassidy needed. My parents insisted it was not favoritism. Cassidy simply needed more support. I was independent. I always landed on my feet. What they never asked was how a child becomes the one who never needs help. Sometimes she learns that asking changes nothing. Dad was gentler than Mom, but he treated silence like neutrality. Whenever I complained, he said, "Don't take it personally." Eventually, I stopped asking him to defend me because begging a passive person to notice your pain becomes its own humiliation. I studied hospitality operations at UMass Amherst because I liked the strange combination of logistics and emotion involved in making people feel cared for. After college, I moved to Boston and worked my way through hotel operations, event management, and eventually large-scale guest experience planning for a regional hospitality group. I became the person companies called when a conference lost a venue 2 weeks before opening, when a hotel renovation ran late, or when 200 wedding guests arrived and somebody had forgotten to tell the kitchen about 25 allergies. I was good under pressure because pressure had always been normal. At work, that skill earned me promotions. At home, it earned me requests. "Marin, can you organize Mom and Dad's anniversary dinner?" "You do events." "Marin, can you fix Cassidy's seating chart?" "You're good at that stuff." "Marin, can you call the rental company?" "Cassidy is overwhelmed." By my late 20s, I had become unpaid operations staff for my own family. Nobody meant it cruelly in the beginning. That is how patterns survive. They begin as favors people are grateful for, then become expectations. People resent you for questioning. Cassidy married her first husband at 28, and I spent 6 months functioning as her unpaid wedding planner because Mom said a professional was too expensive. I negotiated hotel rooms, fixed a catering error, rebuilt the timeline, and covered a deposit when Cassidy's card was declined. On the wedding day, Mom sent me to solve a shuttle problem during the main family photographs. Later, she posted a picture of herself, Dad, Cassidy, the groom, and his parents under the caption, "The people who carried us here." I had literally carried boxes into the venue that morning. The marriage ended 3 years later. Around the same time, my own long relationship ended. Mom called Cassidy brave for leaving something that no longer served her and asked me whether commitment had always been difficult for me. I pulled away, then returned because families have gravity. Dad had surgery. Cassidy opened a floral studio. Mom turned 65. I kept helping. I paid a household bill for my parents, organized systems for Cassidy's business, and spent weekends training her assistant. At the studio opening, Mom praised Cassidy online for building something from nothing. I was visible only as a reflection behind the register. I told myself not to be childish. That sentence did more damage than I understood. The Christmas exclusions became impossible to ignore after I turned 32. One year, Mom said they were keeping it tiny, then social media showed 14 relatives at the house. Another year, Cassidy told me dinner had moved to the 26th, while a cousin posted Christmas night videos from my parents' living room. Whenever I asked, Mom said plans changed and assumed I was too busy to come. I reminded her I had taken vacation. She insisted I had never told her. The following December, I asked for plans weeks in advance. Mom eventually said everyone was staying home. I spent Christmas alone in Boston and learned 2 days later that Cassidy, cousins, an aunt, and my parents had all been together. I finally asked why they kept excluding me. Mom sounded offended. Nobody excludes you. You have created a story because you feel left out. I feel left out because I am left out. See, that intensity is why holidays become difficult. Dad called later and told me not to take it personally. I asked what could be more personal than being omitted from Christmas. He had no answer. Last Christmas broke something open. On December 24th, Mom told me dinner was canceled because Cassidy's new boyfriend, Evan, might have the flu. The next day, Aunt Renee accidentally texted, "Drive safe. Roads are awful." She thought I was coming. Mom and Cassidy stopped answering my calls, so I loaded the gifts I had already bought into my car and drove 4 hours through freezing rain. Their street was packed with familiar cars. Through the window, I saw Dad pouring wine, Cassidy laughing beside a perfectly healthy Evan, and Mom carrying food into a crowded dining room. I sat in my car for several minutes before walking to the door, because I still wanted an explanation less painful than the obvious one. Mom opened it wearing her holiday blouse and looked irritated rather than guilty. "Marin, you should have called. You said Christmas was canceled. Plans changed. You didn't tell me. It happened quickly. A phone call is how somebody 4 hours away becomes nearby." She tightened her mouth. "Do not do this on Christmas." I looked down at the gift bags in my hands. "I brought everyone's presents." Mom sighed. "You can leave them. We already opened gifts." "Not come in. Not warm up. Leave the gifts." Cassidy appeared behind her and said, "Please don't turn this into a thing. We wanted one relaxed holiday. Without me." She rubbed her forehead. "You're proving the point." I drove back to Boston and cried at a rest stop, not only for Christmas but for every favor, cropped photograph, and polite explanation I had accepted because I wanted the family to remain recognizable. After that, I stopped volunteering. When Mom needed a repair, I sent a contractor's number. When Cassidy wanted business help, I said I was unavailable. They called me cold. I replied, "I'm not keeping score. I'm changing what I volunteer for." The drive home mattered more than the confrontation. I kept seeing Mom half closing the door behind her, so the warm room would not spill onto the porch, as if I were not being excluded so much as kept from disturbing the picture. By the time I reached Boston, the gifts were still on their porch and something in me had gone quiet. I stopped asking what I could do differently to be included and started asking why inclusion had always depended on being useful, agreeable, or easy to overlook. That spring, I accepted a senior operations role that let me work remotely most of the month. For years, I had dreamed of owning an old house somewhere quiet, with rooms for books, guests I actually wanted, and silence I could choose. I found Hawthorne House outside Lenox in the Berkshires, an 1,000 898 former summer residence, with 8 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, wide porch, old maple floors, and enough deferred maintenance to frighten sensible buyers. I bought it anyway. Not because I needed 8 bedrooms, but because I wanted one part of my life whose abundance did not require explaining who deserved it more. I restored it slowly and kept the purchase private. My family found out when my contractor posted a restoration photo online, and an old classmate congratulated Mom at church. She called that evening already knowing the bedroom count. 2 days later, Cassidy called. She and Evan had lost their wedding venue after the vineyard changed ownership. "Mom had an idea," she said. "No. You don't even know what I'm asking. You want Hawthorne House." She laughed nervously. "It would be perfect. Historic house, lawn, guest rooms. We'd save a fortune." I told her it was my home, not an event venue. You literally plan events for a living. At properties designed for them. Marin, you have 8 bedrooms. Yes, for one person. Still my home. Her warmth disappeared. After everything this family has done for you, the first beautiful thing you get becomes something nobody can touch? I told her the answer remained no. Then Mom and Dad called, followed by relatives offering compromises involving my property. Restroom trailers, shuttles, smaller guest lists. I finally stopped explaining. The answer is no, because I do not want a wedding at my home. Mom said, "That sounds selfish when you say it plainly." Then plain is useful. For 2 weeks, everyone went quiet. Then a wedding planner emailed me asking where catering deliveries should enter Hawthorne House. Attached was a timeline, naming my address as the venue. The planner was horrified when I said I had never agreed. She told me Mom had described final permission as a formality. I checked Cassidy's wedding website. It called Hawthorne House, the bride's family estate. A private section assigned bedrooms to relatives. Mom and Dad had taken the primary suite. Cassidy and her bridesmaids had the east wing. I had been moved to a lower-level host suite, as if I were staff in my own home. I called Mom. "Why is my house on the wedding website?" "We were going to talk to you." I said no. "You were emotional. We knew you'd come around when you saw the plan. You assigned yourself my bedroom. The parents need a central room. You'll be busy managing things." There it was. Not daughter, staff. I told her to remove everything that day. She replied, "You are 36, unmarried, and living alone in an 8-bedroom house. What exactly are you protecting it from? Family?" I looked around the office I had built with my own money. Yes. The website disappeared that night, but Cassidy posted a vague complaint about having a sister with the perfect venue who would rather watch her lose money than help. Relatives began messaging. I answered each with one sentence. "My home is not available as a wedding venue." The planner froze all work immediately. She had already received a guest count of 92, a floor plan annotated by Mom, and a note saying I would coordinate final operations personally because hospitality is her field. That line made my stomach turn. My career had been converted into unpaid labor before I had even consented to host. The website also listed a welcome dinner on my porch and a farewell brunch in my dining room. Relatives had already begun requesting specific rooms. One cousin wrote that her children needed the room nearest the stairs. An aunt joked that I should save the good bathtub for the bride. None of them had asked me a single question. They were planning around me the way people plan around furniture. When I told the planner the property was unavailable, she apologized 3 times and said, "For what it's worth, I thought it was unusual that the homeowner had never joined a planning call." That sentence stayed with me. Strangers had noticed my absence from my own event before my family did. At Thanksgiving, Mom invited me home to reset as a family. I went because Dad separately said he missed me. 15 relatives were there. For most of dinner, nobody mentioned Hawthorne House, and I almost believed we might get through one holiday honestly. Then Mom brought a folder to the table before dessert. Inside was Cassidy's revised wedding budget. At the bottom, highlighted in yellow, was "Savings if Hawthorne House hosted. $36,800. Mom looked at me. We're asking you to understand what your no is costing your sister. My no isn't costing her anything. Her wedding costs what it costs. Cassidy said that was easy for me because I had money. I told her she and Evan had a budget and could choose a wedding inside it. Aunt Renee suggested only using my lawn. Dad suggested letting immediate family stay overnight. Every compromise still required my house. Evan finally said, I told Cassidy we should book something smaller. Cassidy snapped, not now. Then Mom said, you build walls and complain you're left out. I looked at her. You lied to keep me away from Christmas last year. The room went still. Cassidy said everyone had wanted one peaceful day, because I made everything about fairness. Something in me finally stopped trying to be polite. I have spent my life being told I can handle disappointment better, so disappointment gets assigned to me. Cassidy loses a venue. I should give her my house. Cassidy needs business help. I should fix it. Cassidy wants a relaxed Christmas. I should disappear. Mom cried that she loved us both. I believe you. But you treat loving me as permission to ask more from me because you think I'll survive it. I said I wanted one thing, for them to stop treating my home, time, and money as family property because I was single. Cassidy muttered that 8 bedrooms for one person was ridiculous. Dad surprised everyone. She's right. We assume because Marin doesn't have children, her life is easier to use. Mom snapped his name. But he kept going. We do. Mom looked at me and whispered, you're going to regret being this alone someday. The cruelty silenced the table. I stood. Maybe. But I would rather be alone in a home where I'm respected than surrounded by people who remember me only when they need the keys. I left and spent the night at a hotel. Mom tried to soften the moment by saying I had always been generous, and this was simply another way to show up for Cassidy. I asked why showing up for me had so often meant sending a text after the holiday was already over. Aunt Renee shifted uncomfortably. One cousin quietly admitted she had assumed I was invited every year because Mom always said I was too busy. That was the first time I realized how thoroughly the story had traveled without me. My absence had not looked like exclusion from the outside because Mom had supplied a flattering explanation for everyone. Busy, independent, difficult schedule. The family had been given a version of me that made nobody responsible for noticing the empty chair. The next week, Cassidy and Evan booked a smaller vineyard. It was still beautiful. They simply cut extras they could not afford. Then Mom made one final attempt to turn my no into yes. A photographer emailed asking where to park for the Holt family Christmas portrait session at Hawthorne House on Christmas Eve. A caterer called after that. Aunt Renee finally texted, are we really doing Christmas at your place? Mom had invited relatives without telling me. When I confronted her, she called it healing. I wanted one nice family picture, she said. You have dozens. I'm just not in them. She insisted people had already made plans. I told her to change them. You'd leave family with nowhere to go on Christmas Eve? They have homes. So do I. I had already invited 6 friends and coworkers who had helped me create a life there without ever treating the house like payment. Mom cried. I don't recognize you anymore. You recognized what I provided. Then I ended the call. Christmas Eve came under fresh snow. My invited guests were in the kitchen cooking when headlights appeared on the drive. 4 vehicles pulled up. Mom stepped out first, dressed for photographs. Dad looked miserable. Cassidy, Evan, Aunt Renee, cousins, and older relatives followed with gifts, food trays, overnight bags, and a small artificial tree. Surprise, Mom said. No. She told me people had driven hours. I reminded her I had already said there was no family Christmas at my home. Cassidy stopped unloading. You said Marin changed her mind. Mom waved one hand. I said she would. The crowd shifted. Dad told me Mom had said I agreed to dinner but not overnight. Evan quietly suggested everyone leave. Mom refused. This family has to stop letting Marin dictate everything because she owns the biggest house. I'm deciding who enters my home. Listen to yourself. My house, my rules. Family doesn't talk like that. Theo's widowed mother, June, stepped onto the porch behind me with a dish towel. Families with manners do. Mom stared at her. Who are you? June smiled. Invited. Even Cassidy covered her mouth. Mom demanded to know why strangers could have Christmas with me while family stood outside. People who were invited get Christmas with me. Aunt Renee finally said Mom had told everyone I asked them to come. Dad turned to Mom. You need to stop deciding Marins. No means ask again louder. I had waited decades to hear him say something like that. Cassidy looked at me. I'm sorry. For this and the wedding. I knew you said no, and let Mom convince me you'd cave because you usually do. I thanked her. Mom tried to explain Cassidy's stress. Cassidy said, Stop explaining me. One by one, relatives began calling a nearby inn and changing plans. Nobody was stranded. They were simply forced to solve a problem created by assuming my boundary was temporary. Mom remained after the others started leaving. Are you really not letting me inside? Not tonight. I'm your mother. That's why this hurts. She said she loved me and asked how I could leave her outside. I thought about the previous Christmas when I had stood on her porch holding gifts. The symmetry was dangerous because revenge would have been easy. I chose accuracy instead. Letting you in tonight would teach you that lying works if you arrive with enough witnesses. She finally understood something, even if only structurally. I told her we could talk after Christmas. Then I went inside. My friends did not ask me to explain before feeding me. We ate late. The potatoes were too salty. Someone burned the carrots. Priya set her phone on a stack of books for a group picture and called me over when I started clearing plates. Host gets in the photo. I stood in the middle because there was room. Nobody cropped me later. My invited guests remained inside because I had asked them not to turn the confrontation into a spectacle. Through the windows I could see warm light, plates on the table, and a tree that had no matching ornaments because I had bought whatever I liked. That ordinary scene gave me courage. Mom kept glancing past me as if the house itself were betraying her by being beautiful without her approval. Dad began helping the older relatives repack the cars. Cassidy pulled me aside for a moment and admitted Mom had also told her I was lonely and waiting for an excuse to bring everyone together. I wanted to believe her, Cassidy said, because then I didn't have to admit we were asking you for something you already refused. I told her wanting a different answer did not create a misunderstanding. She nodded. Before leaving, Evan apologized for not checking with me directly. I kept assuming somebody else had, he said. That sentence described half my family history. Everyone assumed somebody else had asked, invited, thanked, or noticed. I had been living in the gap between those assumptions. The months after Christmas were quieter. I went low contact with Mom. Dad apologized for using "keep the peace" as an excuse for silence. I thought your mother's moods were temporary and your strength was permanent, he said. So I kept asking the permanent thing to absorb the temporary one. I told him strength is not a resource other people get to budget. Cassidy and I rebuilt more slowly. She married Evan the following September at the smaller vineyard, and I attended as a guest. No planning, no emergency logistics. When her florist backed out, she asked for recommendations. I gave her 3 names and nothing more. She paused, then laughed. Right. I can call them. At the wedding, the photographer called for immediate family, and Cassidy waved me into the picture. Mom did not hand me her purse or send me to check transportation. We were not repaired. We were practicing something different. Dad eventually came to Hawthorne House alone and spent a weekend helping Theo repair an old porch railing. He never once suggested what the house should become. That restraint mattered more than another apology. Cassidy's wedding was the next real test. I arrived 30 minutes before the ceremony because that was when guests were asked to arrive. No emergency checklist waited for me. No one handed me a vendor phone. When the coordinator asked whether I was family, Cassidy answered from across the room. She's my sister. She's here as my sister. I had to look away for a second. During the reception, Mom started to ask if I could help locate missing favors, stopped herself, and asked the coordinator instead. Tiny moments like that were how trust returned not through speeches, but through people choosing a different reflex. Hawthorne House became what I wanted, sometimes full of friends, sometimes completely quiet. The deeper change was my relationship with usefulness. I had believed being needed was proof of love because my family became warmest when something needed solving. Once I stopped automatically helping, some relationships thinned and others became real. Dad visited without asking me to fix his life. Cassidy began asking which guest room was available instead of choosing one. Mom visited much later and stood in the foyer looking around. "I understand why you wanted this," she said. "A place where nobody can tell you there isn't room." On a second visit, she arrived with one bag and asked, "Can I stay one night?" Then, "Which room?" The question almost made me cry. That evening, she finally said something honest. "Cassidy needed me. You didn't." I knew how to feel important to her. "With you, I felt like I had already missed too much, so I made you difficult because that hurt less than admitting I didn't know how to be your mother." I told her she could have asked. She said, "I know, I'm trying." We never returned to the old relationship. I did not want it. We built a more adult one. Love without automatic access, apologies measured by behavior. Last Christmas, I invited the family to Hawthorne House myself. 8 people. No photographer, no room assignments, no assumptions. We cooked together. Dad used a timer for the group picture. When I drifted toward the side out of habit, Cassidy said, "Marin middle." I stood there not because I had finally earned the center, but because nobody required me to disappear. Later, by the fireplace, I understood that buying the house had not saved me. Saying no before anyone approved of my reason had. Boundaries are not walls built because you hate people. They are doors with handles on your side. They make closeness a choice instead of a job description. My family called me selfish because access had been their normal. Mom called 8 bedrooms wasted on me because she thought unused space was available space. Cassidy assumed I would host her wedding because I had always solved whatever made her anxious. Dad believed silence preserved peace because I paid the emotional cost. None of them were monsters. Ordinary people become deeply entitled when somebody reliable keeps absorbing the consequence. I had been the fixer, planner, payer, photographer, backup driver, and quiet daughter for so long that nobody noticed those were tasks rather than my identity. If you are the dependable person in your family, you may know the feeling. People praise your strength while handing you another box, then accuse you of changing when you finally stop carrying it. They are right. You changed the agreement they were enjoying without ever negotiating it with you. The house also changed the way I understood solitude. At first, every quiet room felt like proof that nobody could reach me. Later, the same quiet stopped feeling defensive. I did not need to fill the bedrooms to justify buying them, just as I did not need a husband, children, or constant guests to justify taking up space. That lesson sounds obvious until you spend years hearing that your time is flexible because you are single, your money is available because you have no children, and your home is excessive because no one else's needs are attached to it. I stopped explaining my choices in advance. I helped family sometimes, but only after being asked, and only when yes felt like generosity rather than surrender. The difference was physical. Chosen help left me warm. Assumed help left me resentful before I even began. I learned to trust that feeling. Mom once told me boundaries had made me harder. I said, no. They made my kindness voluntary. She did not like the sentence at first. Months later, she repeated it back to me when Cassidy declined another family request. That was how I knew some change had actually taken root. I also stopped treating every family invitation as a test I had to pass. If I wanted to go, I went. If the invitation sounded like an obligation wrapped in guilt, I declined. The first time I skipped a Sunday dinner simply because I wanted a quiet weekend, Mom asked 3 times whether something was wrong. I finally said, "Nothing is wrong. I'm allowed to have a life that is not an emergency response to this family." She went silent, then said goodnight. A year earlier, that silence would have ruined my evening. By then, I made tea and finished a book. That was another form of freedom, letting other people be disappointed without immediately turning their disappointment into a task. I had finally learned that peace does not require permission. Today, I am 38. Hawthorne House is still my home, not a wedding venue, not a family hotel, not proof that I am lonely, and not an inheritance people can mentally spend while I am alive. Sometimes all the guest rooms are full. Sometimes every door stays closed for weeks. Both are legitimate, because empty space is still owned space. The old Christmas photograph from the year Mom told me dinner was canceled still exists somewhere online. I used to want her to delete it. I do not anymore. Let it exist. It shows a smiling family with one daughter missing, and that absence is part of the truth. In my dining room now, there is another photograph taken 2 years later. Dad used a timer. Cassidy is laughing. Mom looks nervous because we were still learning. I am standing in the middle because somebody said my name and made room. One photograph shows the family pattern I spent years excusing. The other shows what became possible when I stopped helping everyone pretend there had never been a problem. Self-worth did not come from buying a beautiful house. It came from understanding that I did not have to earn the right to keep what was mine, occupy space, decline a request, or spend Christmas with people who actually wanted me there. And cutting a toxic pattern did not require me to hate my family. It required me to stop sacrificing myself to keep their version of family comfortable. So tell me honestly, if your family repeatedly left you out of holidays, then suddenly treated the home you built for yourself as a free wedding venue, hotel, and Christmas destination, because you were the single daughter with extra space, would genuine apologies and years of changed behavior ever be enough for you to open the door again? Or would you decide that once people teach you they value your access more than your presence, the safest kind of self-respect is keeping that door closed?